The death ball is a term that's become popular in recent months thanks to reporting from ESPN's Jeff Passan as well as thoughts from the third-party player development company known as Tread Athletics. So what on earth is a death ball, and why is the industry so obsessed with naming new pitches? I think it comes down to a basic understanding of our pitch plot. Pitch plots are what analysts and coaches use to understand how a pitch is moving independent of velocity, release, and most importantly in this case, gravity. It's made up of two lines, one vertical and one horizontal, and when you place a pitch on the plot, it's representing the movement of the pitch without regard for gravity. A pitch that ends up in the center of this plot has 0 inches of vertical movement and 0 inches of horizontal movement. You could call this a gravity ball or a pure gyro ball. Imagine that a pitch spins like a football or a pinwheel on its way to the plate, such that none of that spin of the ball is actually contributing to the movement of the pitch in any given direction. It's dropping as though it is only affected by gravity. And as we move away from this center point, the spin of the ball becomes more efficient, and that spin contributes to the movement of the ball in these varying directions. Four-seam fastballs are up here, they have backspin, they're moving up with respect to that ball that drops only because of gravity. Curveballs are down here, they have the opposite of backspin or topspin, therefore they drop much more than the gravity ball and also move right to left. Cutters are usually around here without much side-to-side movement and only a bit more rise relative to that pure gravity ball or gyro ball. And then sliders make up a pretty large portion of our plot. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that our plot is not simply charting where the pitch was located. So if a fastball is placed on the outer third of the plate to a right-handed hitter, it doesn't end up here on a plot. The plot isn't centered over the strike zone. Instead, what happens is the center point shifts based on the trajectory of a pitcher's release. It reminds me a bit of playing an old PS2 game called Resident Evil. It's a third-person shooter where they essentially give you a laser sight on your gun so you can aim despite being outside the body of the actual protagonist. The end of that laser sight is the 0-0 point on our pitch plot, the gyro ball. Depending on where you aim, either the gun or the pitch, the plot is going to move, and then you calculate movement off of that endpoint. The main issue with pitch classification is that sliders cover such a massive portion of this plot relative to other pitches that it's kind of odd we call them all one thing, known as sliders. So the industry last year started tracking sweepers, which have more lateral movement than your general slider. And then they also started tracking slurves, which are like sweepers, they just have a bit more drop. This separates that massive slider blob into 3 smaller blobs: sweepers, slurves, and gyro sliders, which are the sliders that have the least amount of that lateral movement. The death ball is a particular subset within that gyro slider bucket. They have more drop than the regular population of gyro sliders, and they don't have the big glove side movement of a curveball or a sweeper. In the broad sense, this pitch is a slider. In the more specific sense, it's a gyro slider, and in the most specific sense, it's a death ball. The advantage of a death ball over something like a curveball, after doing some asking around in the industry, boils down to, I think, 2 points. One, you can generally throw it a bit harder than an average curveball. This is because you don't need to fully be in front of the ball like a curveball, and the more you orient yourself behind the ball at release, the more velocity you're going to be able to impart on the ball. Number 2, they don't have the same pop out of hand as a curveball, so it makes them perhaps slightly more deceptive, and that's because, again, you're not generating a ton of topspin on the pitch because you're not totally in front of the ball. From the data side of things, death balls are marginally better than the larger subset of gyro sliders, and you can see that here in the data. Much of the contact quality stats are lower, by a decent margin actually, while the swinging strike rate is basically the same. The only issue is that the sample of death balls we have is much, much smaller. Depending on how you categorize it, it makes up only about 5 to 10% of the total sample of gyro sliders generally. So it's hard to say, yes, everybody should totally be throwing this death ball as if it's the new hot thing that the sweeper was in 2023. Which is why the guys at Tread Athletics talk a lot about how the pitch is generally best suited for higher arm angle throwers, such that the pitcher creates a steep approach angle into the zone from a high release with this kind of pitch. It gives them kind of a non-curveball offering that has a good amount of drop to it. This applies nicely to a guy like Jordan Montgomery, who has an above average release height, or Bryce Elder from the Braves, who is also a high release guy with some funky shapes and throws something that I think I would consider a death ball. The Tigers closer Alex Lang is not really a high release guy, but he's also a poster boy of this death ball shape. So as with many things in pitching, it's very pitcher dependent as to whether this pitch actually fits in a repertoire and with the arm angle of the pitcher that is throwing it. Now you may be wondering to yourself, why on earth do we need all these different subtypes of pitches? And I think that's a totally valid question. For me, it comes down to what you're trying to communicate. Subtypes give a pitcher, a hitter, a coach, an analyst like myself, someone who just enjoys watching baseball, a better understanding of how exactly that slider is moving. It's a slider, but how exactly is it different than other sliders that you've seen that have all been named the same thing? And the question for me is whether providing that extra step of understanding actually creates any value. And the answer to that question comes down to who you are. For coaches like those at Tread Athletics, it's important to have a common language or a specific set of shapes that they can reference, especially when working with athletes in pitch design sessions. The best metaphor I've heard to justify the usefulness of these subtypes was relating it back to the idea that Eskimos actually have 50 words for snow, each representing different kinds of snow, such that when one says a specific word, they know exactly what kind of snow they're talking about. So why not have subtypes that help us distinguish between different kinds of sliders or pitches in the same manner? Maybe not up to 50, but you kind of get the point of why that specificity could matter. But I don't think it's necessary to the average viewer or consumer to have to subtype all these pitches to them and then rename them such that they understand this new set of common language. What I propose instead is to just freeze the subtyping, right? Freeze it at sliders and freeze it at sweepers. We can distinguish between them, I think because sweeper is very intuitive that it has a lot of sweep. And then from those two subtype classifications, we go into other directions and add qualifiers to those two main subtypes such that people understand why one sweeper is different than another or why one slider is different than another. For example, a slurve is a sweeper with more drop. A death ball is a gyro slider, as we talked about, that has more drop. A slutter, which is a term that I don't know if people like, but I think it's hilarious, is a gyro slider with a bit more lift. The specific terms, in my opinion, have more utility to coaches, players, and hitters who need that mental map or that common language to quickly pull up an understanding of how that specific pitch is moving for them to either cue it differently or approach it differently as a hitter. And you compare that to the general public, there nearly isn't as much utility. And I think sometimes we blur those lines, always assuming that the public wants a better understanding, or making it almost seem like the death ball is a new pitch when there's probably guys back in the 80s, 90s, and 60s and 70s that threw a similar offering. It's the same idea with the sweeper. That pitch has been around for a while, we just have a better understanding of how to measure it, how to track it, and how to influence it such that we make it an even better pitch. That's kind of all analytics is doing, right? We're measuring things and helping people understand and become better consumers of baseball as well as players when you get down to the player level and the field level. So that's my thoughts on subclassification generally and the death ball, which is a really fun thing to say, so I understand why it caught on, but at the same time, again, I don't think it has too much utility outside of the player or coach, especially for how small the sample is. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, I'm always in the comments if you have thoughts, concerns, questions, anything. I'm there. Thank you for watching.